I'm Aaron Sagers, and this is Talking Strange. Aloha, spooky nerds, and welcome to Talking Strange, a paranormal pop culture show with a Den of Geek network, available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. I'm your host, journalist, author, researcher of weird things, Aaron Sagers. You can also catch me as the host of the Netflix series 28 Days Haunted and on the Travel Channel and Discovery Plus show Paranormal Caught On Camera. Now, in director Mark Jenkin's new Cornish Folk Horror, Enys Men, routine is unsettling. Set in 1973 on the uninhabited island of Enys Men, which translates from Stone Island in Cornish, each day a nameless volunteer played by Mary Woodvine starts up a generator and makes tea, checks her wildflowers, measures soil temperature, and drops a stone in a mine shaft as she listens to hear it drop below. Then she records no change in a journal. But then things do begin to change. The concept of time begins to fluctuate. Even from the film's early moments, you can see that, or at least for the very observant viewer. Though she is meant to be on the island alone, she begins to encounter and interact with either strange visitors or maybe they are phantoms. Then there are the lichens, or lichens if you prefer. The composite organism begins to appear on flowers and then starts to grow on her own body. This all takes place as this large stone monument stands sentry outside of her cottage until it doesn't. Filmed in 16 millimeter, Enys Men is grainy. It's effectively plays with color. It highlights Woodvine's icy blue eyes and her red rain slicker. And it's evocative of the slicker seen in Don't Look Now, which was also released in 1973. Moreover, Enys Men feels like a video lost in time. It plays out as if the viewer is witnessing a story told out of sequence, watching the slow unraveling of reality and of the volunteer's sanity. Jenkin, who previously won a BAFTA for his film Bait, joined me for this episode to discuss this slow burn, deliberately paced film. It premiered in 2022 at the Cannes Film Festival. And in the following conversation about Enys Men, he shares with me why it's defined as a Cornish folk horror. What does that even mean? As well as his intentional as well as accidental homages to 1970s horror and the film's experiment with the unsettling nature of time. So let's check it out. First off, thanks so much for joining me today. It's nice to chat with you. So I saw in some of your director's notes that you refer to this as a Cornish folk horror, and I was curious if you could elaborate on that. Explain why in your mind you would consider it a Cornish folk horror.
Well, I mean, to start with, we needed a label for it. I think I was pressed to describe it, and originally I came up with Cornish. The original description was a lost Cornish folk horror, and then somebody said, I think somebody in the marketing team said, don't describe the film as lost. That's not a good starting point. So then it was a Cornish folk horror, and then I was wary of using the word horror. I didn't know whether we wanted to promote it as a horror film, because my fear was that horror fans might be disappointed by the horror element, and I also thought that a lot of the audience who thought they didn't like horror films wouldn't even come and see the film. So then I thought, let's not call it horror. So then it was called, we were referring to it as Cornish folk, which doesn't mean anything. So then we dropped folk and we started describing it just as a Cornish film. But I think we've gone full circle and gone back to kind of based on the audience reaction, I'm quite happy calling it a folk horror again. My keenness to call it a Cornish folk horror was down to my own idea that folk horror was kind of like a British or even an English subgenre of horror that I didn't want to really associate with, because I didn't think we were part of that kind of pastoral, merry old England. Because in Cornwall, we're not that historically, culturally. We're not merry old England. So I was very keen to put Cornish in there. Since then, I've educated myself more and realised that there is wherever there's a cinema tradition, there is also a folk tradition, and that inevitably there's a folk horror tradition. Mm-hmm. So I think for me, all those words are kind of important. The Cornishness of it is important because it's a Cornish film. It was made in Cornwall. It's the setting is Cornish. Folk horror, I think, is a little bit tricky just because of the problems with definition of what folk horror is. And somebody pointed out to me the other day actually that my previous film Bait may even be more of a folk horror than Enys Men is, if you look at certain definitions of folk horror, which is the sort of urban sophisticates going to a rural location and being terrorized by the locals.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, there's this ethereal and mysterious element to the film, and perhaps while trying to decipher it, tell me if I'm overreaching here, but the lichens or lichens that appear regularly throughout the movie, they're a composite organism. Is this a composite ghost story where the land itself is also part of the haunting?
You could read it as that, yeah. I'm not going to go into too much detail about meaning. I mean, a lot of people have talked about the lichen element and asked me about the lichen element, and it's really good to hear you've obviously got some understanding of what lichen is and what it's believed to be, because I think that we're only really just learning about lichen and its many mysteries. But I mean, I think the lichen is kind of central to the theme of the film. For me, more in terms of its timelessness and its ability to sort of adapt and outlive everything else. But yeah, I like your reading.
Okay. And the timelessness of it, and I certainly don't think I'm spoiling anything here, but there is a radio broadcast in the beginning that suggests time is fluid. The radio broadcast is taking place 50 years from where we are observing the volunteer. Is there a time setting to this?
Well, it's 1973 as a starting point, but it might time certainly seems to be moving in all directions rather than just in one direction. But in fact, that radio thing, I'm so, it's great that you picked up on that, because actually I watched the film for the first time in quite a long time must have been in New York, actually. That was the last time I saw it, and I hadn't seen it since we were in Cannes. And that radio report, I listened to it as I was watching the film, and it was almost like I was watching the film objectively for the first time. And that actually scared me a little bit, because I'd forgotten about that. And I'm not normally, when I was working on the film, I wasn't listening to that, that sort of background sound. I would have been I was looking at the performance and the color grading and the way it was cutting together. And I finally got to the point where I was relaxed with the film. The film was a finished object that I was just watching it was in the Walter Reed at Lincoln Center, and I got as close to being an audience member as I could get, I think. And I just listened to the radio thing, and it kind of freaked me out a little bit, and it reminded me of why I put that in, because when time doesn't make sense, that's true horror for me. I remember the first time I saw Don't Look Now, and where Donald Sutherland sees the barge go by. And I remember watching that and thinking, what's going on there? And being really confused, like the character is. And then 10 minutes later, the penny dropping and just going, just like absolute chilling moment of going, right, well, time's slipping. He's seen the future. It's a premonition. And so that stuff really, really unsettles me. And I didn't think I'd ever get to the point that I would watch it. I would be unsettled by something I'd done in my own film. But I think a combination of distance from the film and also probably a bit of jet lag allowed me to but I'm really glad, because it's a fine balance when you do something like that, when you put something on the radio like that, which effectively it's exposition, so it's quite easy to do. Let's spoon feed the audience something out of this radio thing that you can tweak and tweak and tweak until the final minute of the dubbing. And it's like, well, how loud is it going to be in the mix? And you can talk for weeks about, let's put it up a couple of dB, and then it's like, no, but then you're hitting the audience over the head. So for me, it's really rewarding when somebody like yourself comes back and hears the detail of the radio report.
Well,
so
and
thank you.
Oh yeah, and no, thank you for including, because it's clearly something that, especially because it's immediately you're establishing there's so little dialogue, so you're locking into something like that. Like, this must be important, pay attention. I'm glad, I really appreciate that you brought up Don't Look Now, because like that film, this is a film where color just seems so important and is popping in such a significant way, and then aesthetically this film does feel locked into the 70s and the early 70s. It's very moody. This is is this an intentional homage to horror of that era, to Hammer horror?
I knew that it was going to be set in the early 70s. I wrote it to be set in 1973, so I wanted it to feel of that era without really being too over the top about it. I didn't think about it when we were shooting it at all. I didn't think this is a film that's set in the 70s, but the equipment that I use and the way that I work with that equipment, so using a Bolex camera that's just there on my shoulder, and it's clockwork. You can only run the camera for 27 seconds with one wind. It takes 100-foot rolls of film, so you're constantly changing rolls. So there's a fragmented way that I shoot, which leads to a lot of montage within the edit. Also, not recording any sound, post-syncing all the sound, using old lenses. That's all of the stuff that I love using. So just through the equipment that I choose to use, it's going to have that aesthetic. I don't have to think about it at all when I'm shooting. But I think it was, I love that era of film making. So, and there's no direct homage there. The obvious one is Don't Look Now, and which people have pointed out because of the red jacket. And I've tried to stay away from that. So I can't believe that I brought up Don't Look Now in this conversation before you did. But the red jacket wasn't a deliberate homage. That was something I accidentally walked into, because originally Mary's character was going to have the yellow jacket and the boatman was going to have the red jacket. So it was going to be the other way around. But quite late on in pre-production, I started to worry that Mary with long brown hair, blue jeans and a yellow jacket was going to look like Charlotte Gainsbourg's character in Lars von Trier's Antichrist. And so I switched the costumes because I thought, I don't want somebody thinking it's a homage to Antichrist. And then very early on in the shoot, the first day, I think I heard somebody in the art department say to one of the trainees, "Oh yeah, the costumes are homage to Don't Look Now." And I was like, well, yeah, of course, I've walked straight into that, and Nick Rogue is, one of the masters as far as I'm concerned. So I think Rogue's influence on the film is everywhere. But the red jacket isn't part of that. That was a genuine accident that I wandered into.
Yeah. This is, I think, a film that demands attention, but it's also a film that's going to challenge people. And I was curious, like, how would you invite people into this film?
I don't know. I think if I knew that, I'd be working in marketing. I mean, I was talking about this last night. I was talking to Kyle, who made Skinamarink, and we were talking about, we were asked why it's important to see the film at the cinema, in movie theaters, rather than seeing it at home, and I got thinking about that last night, and just the idea that there's something so distinct about going and seeing a film like this, or like Skinamarink, within a theater, and it's about the cinematic nature of it. It doesn't mean cinematic in terms of scale of what you're seeing on the screen, or even anything that you're seeing on the screen or coming out the speakers. It's about that environment of being locked in a black box for an hour and a half and experiencing something without distraction. And I know you can do that at home under certain circumstances, but my thought last night was, the thing about going to the cinema to see a film is, and especially if it's something that unsettles you, when you leave, you've then got to get yourself home. And if that film is continuing to play, continuing to haunt you, and has got under your skin, that for me, that's a really incredible experience. That I remember when I went to see Black Swan, and I went to see it on my own in a theatre a couple of miles away from where I live here, and I had to cycle home afterwards. And still now, all these years later, it's the most vivid memory of cycling back with this film continuing to play in my head. And I think they're the films that I like, you know, the ones that you leave the theatre and they're still playing in your head. And with this one, I think we made a 3-act. I think Enys Men is a 3-act film. We just didn't shoot the 3rd act. So the 3rd act is for the audience to play out in their head when they leave the cinema. So again, you know, I know that approach isn't for everybody, but for those that do respond to those films, and I think this will be a good experience.
Yeah, I'm based in Brooklyn, New York, so I can most certainly think of the theater that I would like to go see this in, and then have the conversation with people right afterwards about it and about what it means. And I know we're running out of time, but I was just curious, is there an order to this film where you could arrange it in a linear way?
You could, but I think it would drive you mad, because I think you'd get to the stage where you might start doing that, and by the time you get to the end, you think you've got everything in place, and then you get the last end bit in place, and then you realize, well, if that's the case, then the beginning doesn't make sense, and so you have to switch it around. So I think that's for me, that's the thing that intrigues me about time, is that if you think about it too much, it kind of drives you mad. You just have to experience it and get through it the best you can, because yeah, I always think, you know, there's no past and there's no future. There's only the present moment. The past is just a reimagining from the present moment with a shifting context, and the future is the same. And I think that the film kind of works in that space, I hope.
I just wanted to ask about the volunteer, about Mary, the actor in this role, and just why everything is really resting on her, and she's integral to this. So just the process of pulling her in on this and her being the right person for the volunteer, it's just exceptional acting.
Yeah, I think it's an incredible performance. What I always said to her was that, you know, if this film works, I said, it will be down to your performance. And I said, and if it doesn't work, it will be my responsibility, just to try and, you know, which I think is always the case with filmmaking. It's not an actor's medium in terms of the control. Ultimately, I have the control, but I can only make a good film if she gives me the building blocks to create that. And I always knew that, you know, I wrote the film for her, and then went through quite a lengthy casting process, because I thought it was too obvious to cast her in it. And then gradually, you know, and then went all around the houses and came back and just said, you know, actually, I wrote this film for you. It should be you. And I now know there's no way I could have made this film without Mary. And I know everybody says that, you know, because once the film's finished, you can't picture the film with somebody else in it. But I genuinely think if it was with somebody else, we'd still be shooting it now. But because me and her have got quite a very strong shorthand, she knows what I want and what I can do, and I know what she's capable of, and we can push each other. And that's, you know, that's where we got this kind of performance from. I think she's a theatre actor, or has been a theatre actor predominantly. She grew up in kind of a theatre family. She's at the moment in rehearsals just up the road for a show. And obviously with theatre acting, you rely on dialogue, on words, and on big gesture. And the way that I work, there's very few words, there's very little room for gesture, but all of that internal stuff is going on as she's built a character. And if it can't come out through words and through gesture, it comes out through the eyes and through, you know, the window to the soul. And I think that's why I think it's such a great performance.
Well, and kudos to her. I mean, it is just such a exposed and just very close up performance. Yeah, and she definitely brings it home. So, Mark, thanks so much for your time today. I really enjoyed it. I look forward to seeing it in the theater and discussing it afterwards with other folks. So, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Aaron. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
And that was director Mark Jenkins, whose new movie, the Cornish Folk Horror, Enys Men, is open in select cinemas now. And this has been Talking Strange. If you have stories you'd like to share of the strange and unusual or have guest suggestions, email us at talkingstrange@denofgeek.com. I'm Aaron Sagers, and until next time, be kind, stay spooky, and keep it weird.